Intel's Rocket Lake was honestly a very disappointing launch on the higher end of things. Don't get me wrong, 8 cores and 16 threads are still plenty for gaming, but compared to 10th gen's 10-core flagship, it just felt like more performance was left on the table due to 2 cores being cut, and as a result, this launch cycle has been lukewarm to say the least. However, there have been some gems that were ignored by a lot of us, and slipped under the radar due to the disappointing higher end products. Cue the i5-11400, the new entry-level Rocket Lake i5, rocking a new core architecture as well as an overhauled iGPU. For $189 though, how does it perform, and is it worth considering over AMD's more expensive Zen 3-based 6-core chips? Well, perhaps. Digging into the heart of this chip, we've actually got a cool little upgrade this generation that helps to bring a nice performance bump for the price. Under the new cool looking IHS is a cut down Rocket Lake S die, meaning we get a full 6 cores and 12 threads along with the new Iris Z integrated graphics. This is the cut down variant though, meaning we only get 24 execution units or the equivalent to about 192 cores. This puts it in competition with AMD's Vega 3 iGPU, so in terms of relative power balance in the chip, it's much more in favor of the CPU, which is understandable in a chip targeting the desktop market. I'm not going to go too deep into the new Gen 12.1 integrated graphics, as I have plans to make an entire video exploring the side of the equation. Today though, what we're going to be focusing on is strictly the CPU side, and how Intel changed the underlying microarchitecture to get what we have in front of us. Let's call out the elephant in the room. This is still 14nm+++. If you're looking for Intel's 10nm parts or their upcoming Intel 7 node, we're going to have to wait for the release of their Alder Lake line to finally get our hands on Intel's latest lithographic technology. Starting from the ground up though, we've got Cypress Cove cores, which are a 14nm adaptation of the 10nm design Sunny Cove cores. When compared to previous generation's Skylake, these cores are physically larger thanks to the new wider yet thinner die, and all the extra logic that came packed in with Sunny Cove. This includes new instructions like AVX512, which are a welcome addition as this is the debut series for this ISA extension in the consumer market. Legacy instructions are also included as well as hyperthreading, which although drawing more voltage, allows our chip to process twice the amount of threads at once, giving us the 12 we find on the spec sheet. The clocks for this chip are also relatively slow when compared to the final generations of Skylake, with a base clock of 2.6 GHz and a boost clock of 4.2 GHz. It's more than fast enough for a desktop chip, and it's important to keep in mind that it spends most of the time at the boost clocks if you've got a decent cooling solution. Other considerations had to be kept in mind as well when porting these cores from 10nm to 14nm, such as circuit layout, wire capacitance, and other physical effects that occur at scales this small. This means that certain configurations are not only physically larger on the older node, but they also might need different circuit layouts, which could eat into spaces where other traces or logic are contained in. This scale and translation has to occur for all parts of the processor, meaning we get larger cores that require more power. We'll get to performance later in this review, but it is worth noting that if you intend to pick one of these chips up, you'll probably want to use something other than the stock cooler that comes with it. It got a cool redesign and looks like it belongs in a modern system, but its raw surface area is still relatively small, making it hard to recommend to run this thing, especially if you plan on changing some settings like what we're using in this video. It's because of this, it might be worth picking up something like a Hyper 212 Evo if you're eyeing one of these processors. It couldn't hurt, and it might actually help out your processor since it won't be thermally constrained. This leads nicely into power draw, which for this chip is rated at a 65 watt TDP. However, when it comes to actual power draw, we're looking in the ballpark of 95 watts when boosting the clocks. It's also worth noting that for this review, I'm testing the chip with the highest load line calibration setting, which can be found in the BIOS. This means we're feeding more power into the chip, allowing it to boost its clocks more consistently. It's kind of like overclocking, but instead targets the power circuitry to deliver the maximum performance. This may lead to some of the numbers in this video looking inconsistent with other reviewers, and it's something Hardware Unboxed made a whole video about, which I highly recommend checking out. These aren't stock settings, but for me at least, if I paid for the whole chip, I'm gonna use the whole chip, and tweaks like this may be something you'll want to consider at home. Moving into on-die memory, the cache pipeline is almost identical to that found in Sunny Cove, with each core having 64 kilobytes of L1 data cache and a 256 kilobyte block of L2 cache, along with a shared 12 megs of L3. This level 3 cache setup is almost identical to the i7-8700K, but it is worth noting that the i5-11400 contains more total L1 and L2 cache than the former. This helps give Cypress Cove cores a performance advantage over Skylake, but also means that access latencies are slightly higher. This means Intel is able to physically store more data inside the cores, which means less fetching from your system's main memory pool, but it's a trade-off that Intel has to make in order to keep the new cores fed with the data, and is also mostly mitigated by increasing the amount of execution ports by 2, giving us 10 per core. This is ultimately what causes the IPC increase with this generation, as each core in the chip is able to compute more things at once. The pipelines got physically wider, which is why the cores are so much larger than the previous generations, and also why these chips consume so much power. While the i5-11400 has a rated TDP of 65 watts, with the motherboard I'll be testing with, I've removed power limits to keep our clock speeds high, and also tested initially with the stock cooler. After a few runs, I then switched it out for a 240mm AIO, and the chip ran much cooler. If you're looking at one of these chips, it's also important to keep in mind your board selection, as if you're familiar with what's been going on with the B560 boards, some of them are throttling performance due to the VRMs either being low quality, or just not enough of them, meaning too much power is being pumped through some of these regulators. My advice is to buy a board with more quality chokes wrapped around the socket, or go by price. Don't buy the cheapest board you can find, but also you don't need to buy the most expensive one either. Somewhere in the middle is where you'll find the best bang for your buck, along with a board that will allow for your chip to perform at peak spec. For this review, I've got a Gigabyte Z590 Ultra Durable, which although rated for overclockable processors, means we get all the power delivery goodness that comes with the Z-series board, tying this back into the load line calibration settings I discussed earlier. This also allows our chip to sustain a 100 watt power draw, meaning we're getting better overall performance thanks to the improved power delivery, allowing our chip to boost its clocks more consistently. This sort of behavior from the chip will depend on which board you plan on picking up, so once again I'd go with a motherboard that's able to deliver stable power, but you don't need an overkill one to socket the chip in. It would work perfectly fine in a cheaper B560 board, and for a locked chip like this i5 we've got here, I'd recommend one of those over the Z series. I'm simply using this board as I got it on sale at Micro Center, and my previous generation Z490 board just stopped working. It also has beefier power delivery than what's truly needed, ensuring high performance is maintained at all times. This board also has 3 full NVMe slots, allowing us to take full advantage of the 20 PCIe Gen 4.0 lanes off this CPU. This is an upgrade over the 16 Gen 3 lanes found in the previous 5 generations of parts. It translates to faster NVMe performance, mainly felt in boot times, and also means you can stick in a single drive without taking any lanes from your GPU. In terms of performance though, 8 Gen 4 lanes are more than enough for a modern GPU, meaning we can comfortably fill all the NVMe sockets on this board without seeing a degradation in performance on the GPU. Moving into our test system, we're utilizing the previously mentioned Gigabyte Z590 UD, along with 32 gigs of DDR4 capable of 3200 megatransfers per second. While this chip supports the memory speeds we're using, memory overclocking is actually supported, but like most Intel chips, I would recommend spending your hard-earned cash on higher capacities rather than higher clocks. We're also utilizing a Samsung 860 QVO to run all our games off of to try and remove any storage bottlenecks that could potentially hold our chip back. Without any further ado, let's dive into the i5-11400 and determine if the chip is worth buying in this incredibly competitive market. Overall, the Intel Core i5-11400 is actually an awesome gaming chip that also has the chops to do some light content creation. Even though it lags behind AMD's most recent Ryzen 5 line, what it offers is performance comparable to an i7-9700K for around $180. If you've seen my 9700K review, it actually proves to be a great chip, despite its 8-threaded design, and the performance profile is beyond impressive for casual and heavy gaming. The i5-11400, however, offers a very strong 6-core 12-thread alternative, and actually gives it the edge over the previously mentioned 9700K in productivity workloads. Even for the time, the i7-9700K was a minor step up from the i7-8700K, which has nearly identical specs to the 11400. However, given the architectural improvements brought on by the upgrade from Skylake to Cypress Cove, the 12 threads of the 11400 are much stronger on an individual level, giving it a sound lead over the older 14nm designs. In terms of performance, it's incredibly impressive for being a locked processor, and its 12-threaded nature allows it to tackle some multi-threaded workloads. If you're looking for a chip that will allow you to play upcoming AAA titles, then the i5-11400 proves to be beyond capable, making me comfortable recommending this chip for gamers. Despite some of the downsides discussed earlier in this video, specifically the older lithography and the higher power draw, are negated by the high performance on offer, and gives the 11th generation of chips a slight edge over Skylake in terms of performance per watt. In fact, if you're concerned about power usage, I would recommend one of these locked chips over the unlocked SKUs, as power consumption is much more under control. This means you can get away with a cheaper cooler as well. However, I wouldn't recommend using the stock cooler long term, as it's still inadequate at keeping the chip's thermals under control when clocks are boosting. On top of that, the i5 also has some settings that can be tweaked in BIOS, which gives extra performance at the cost of efficiency. This chip is overall an excellent budget to mid-range gaming processor. With 12 threads, it's able to handle any task you throw at it, and the inclusion of more exotic instruction sets helps to speed up performance in applications that support the features. Despite Intel's aging 14nm lithographic node, the performance on offer is incredibly impressive when taking only transistor size and layout into account, and it's a feat that shouldn't be ignored. Sure, it falls behind what AMD offers with the Ryzen 5 5600X, but for the price, it's hard to argue with the 11400, and given the new microarchitecture, it's a powerful and very capable processor. I can't wait to see how this chip will age as we move deeper into this new generation, specifically with 6 cores and 12 threads.